Our next science skill is making observations and inferences. They're crucial skills when doing science. So go ahead and set up your page. Open your notebook to the next blank page. You can label it Observations and Inferences Notes. Please make sure that you put the date that you're taking the notes on there. Then go ahead and divide your paper into two parts. You want big ideas on your left with a narrower column, supporting details on the right. Make sure that you pause the video now and do that. Okay, let's take a look at what observations and inferences are, because as I wrote up here, it really is where science begins. Scientists generally start the process with making an observation. It's more like, look at that. I wonder why. And then that gets the whole ball rolling. So what is an observation? An observation is simply using one or more of your five senses to gather information about your surroundings. So, I see this, I hear this, I feel this, I smell, I taste. So any one or more of your five senses gathering information about your surroundings. And we do this all day long without even thinking about it. And in science, we want to make sure that we're taking the time to really focus on the observations that we're making. We want to make sure that they're both accurate and objective. This basically means is that we're keeping our opinions out of it and that we're giving the clearest, most correct observation. When we're talking about accurate, we're talking about like it's correct, it's right. So if you're making a measurement, that's a type of observation. You want to make sure that you really take your time and make an accurate measurement. And when we're talking about being objective, objective is kind of a tricky word. It's not the objective, like the objective of this lesson is to learn about observations and inferences. Objective in this sense means that it's free of opinion and bias. So if I'm making an objective opinion or observation, I would say my desk is brown. Where if I was making a subjective, not objective observation, I would say my desk is ugly. Like that's my opinion, right? So I'm not including any opinions when I make these observations. So let's get started. Let's take a look at this chair here, see if we can make some objective and accurate observations about it. So a couple things are right off the bat are it's red. You could say that it's kind of quilted in that there's quilting done there. You can say how many wheels it has, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 wheels. You can say it has a metal or silver base. You can measure, say, the height of it or the width. All of those would be accurate and objective observations. You wouldn't want to say things like, it's comfortable. That is not objective, it's your own opinion. There are two main types of observations that we'll be making. Those two main types of observations are qualitative observations and quantitative observations. So let's look at those a little more detailed. One is a qualitative observation. Now these are observations that you make that do not include specific measurements. So things like the table is brown, the sky is blue, the texture is rough, the sound is loud, things like that are all qualitative observations. Whereas quantitative observations are things that require some sort of counting or measurements. You can think of it using the root word of each of the words here. So the root of quantitative observation is quantity. Quantity means an amount or a value. Qualitative would be quality, things like its basic characteristics. So if we're making a quantitative observation, we must go a step further and make some sort of measurement. You can think of it, oftentimes you're using some sort of tool to make a quantitative observation. So I could say my desk is 1.5 meters long. There are 29 desks in my classroom. The whiteboard is so and so long. So all of those require some sort of counting or measurement in order to make that observation. So let's look at an example here. We've got a hotel room. Let's make some qualitative and quantitative observations. I'm going to start with some qualitative observations. So we can say there are red, looks like these are blankets of some sort. They are gold curtains. There is a TV on the table. All of those are qualitative observation. The walls are white, and so on. Quantitative, let's go ahead and start quantifying this. There are 1, 2, 3 lamps. There are 2 beds, 2 chairs. We could do some measurements. The window is how long and how wide. All of those are quantities quantifying the data. Now, what we're really doing in science when we're collecting observations is actually collecting data. So when we make observations, as soon as we write it down in our handy-dandy science notebook, we've collected data. And data can be both qualitative and quantitative observations. So simply noting the color or say the behavior of something is a qualitative observation. It's still considered data. We're collecting that data, we're writing it down, and we can use it to draw conclusions. Same thing with quantitative observations. You write the measurements down, you've collected data, you can use that to draw conclusions. Which brings us to the last step here is inferences. Inferences are conclusions, explanations, or interpretations that you make from your data. So you make an observation and then you draw a conclusion. This is still not an opinion. Be careful not to say things like I like it, or it's the best, or it's the worst, or it's ugly, or stupid, or something like that. You're simply taking what you learned from your observations and drawing a reasonable or logical conclusion based on those observations. You can only include the information you have from your data. This is probably the hardest thing. Even if you have outside information, can't include that. You have to go just with what your data is telling you. So let's look at some, my favorite example of collecting data and making an inference here. You may have seen this before, but here in Scotland, we have a weather forecasting stone. So here on this side, we have observations. On the right side is a reasonable conclusion based on that observation. So if the stone is wet, it's raining. It's a reasonable conclusion. It doesn't mean that that's absolutely the case, but it's a reasonable conclusion. If it's dry, it's not raining. If it's casting a shadow, it's sunny. If there's some white on the top, it's snowing. Can't see the stone, foggy, and so on. So again, we've made a completely objective observation. Looking at the stone, we can make that observation, and then we drew a reasonable conclusion based just on that data. Okay. So we're going to make some observations and inferences throughout the year in this class. Make sure that they're objective and reasonable.